our roots are both radical and conservative, and the tension between the two is why our society has remained free for as long as it has.
Neither Adams nor Hamilton or any of the other critics of the American Revolution and critics of Paine would ever abandon what they regarded, I think, as their common premises, or at least those premises which they in fact had in common, such as natural rights and species of equality and civil society by consent and so forth. Is it possible? Is it a good thing to have a conservative party or a conservative opposition that also stands on the Declaration of Independence, or is it better to have a conservative opposition that is critical or wary of it in some of the ways, say, that Burke or Burkeans since have been?
I think that you have to start with the Declaration of Independence, not only because it is at the beginning of our story, but because it is true, especially because it is true. But its truth is more complicated than simply the first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. There's a question in the Declaration which is not answered, and I think one way of phrasing that question is whether or not the regime that preceded the British mistreatment of the Americans was a legitimate regime. The list of grievances that ends the Declaration suggests that it was, that one of the wrongs done to the Americans by the North administration was taking away the form of government they had before. There's another way to read the Declaration as an entirely new beginning on new principles, and that would suggest that the government they were living under before was an illegitimate government. I think both of those ideas are actually in the Declaration, and the debate about the Declaration is therefore, in part, a debate between those two views. I think that there's a Burkean reading of the Declaration of Independence that sees it as trying to save what was legitimate and right about the regime that preceded the terrible acts that led to the revolution, rather than as starting anew, starting fresh from entirely new roots and on entirely new foundations. That, to me, is a conservative radical debate, a conservative progressive debate. It's a very American debate. I think what it means for conservatives, in part, is that we do have to see the progressives that we fight with as themselves rooted in American life. They're not simply an innovation, an imported idea from Germany. Of course, there's a lot of truth to that too, but it does draw on a tradition that is Jeffersonian in some important respects. And the people who made that argument, the Herbert Croleys, were not simply wrong, though they were not comprehensively right. But it also means that in drawing on the Declaration, we have to think about it both as a conservative document and as a radical document, and as true in both respects. The liberal society it always contains that debate, and I think that's another reason why thinking about our roots as a debate is a helpful way to think about them, because our roots are both Burkean and Painian. Our roots are both radical and conservative, and the tension between the two is why our society has remained free for as long as it has. That was not the case with the French Revolution, for example, which was simply a radical revolution, and lacking that tension went off the rails very quickly. But Americans have always had a legitimate argument about whether we are a conservative country or a radical country, and the answer is yes, and that means that we are always going to live with a left-right debate.
Depending on what you mean by radical and conservative, obviously.
Sure.
But I mean, who ever said, except Paine, that the teaching of the Declaration of Independence, or whatever you want to say, it fit into that place, condemned the previous British government as inherently unjust? I mean, the whole argument of the Declaration is it was a monarchy, which was a good form of government,
right.
Mixed and with some checks and balances, as it were, in it. But it became a tyranny, and when it became a tyranny, it was insufferable, and that's when we had to revolt.
Well, so I mean, Paine is
Jefferson
very explicit.
Never said that,
Paine is very explicit in rejecting that view, right?
Yes.
Common sense says that monarchy is illegitimate.
But that's one of nobody else really said that, did they?
Well, that's right, but you have to ask
others
yourself.
Joined in maybe after he said it.
Yeah, I think that Jefferson later on at least suggests that monarchy is an illegitimate form of government. And, once the revolution had been launched the way it had been launched, I think there was a kind of Jeffersonian party that, in accusing Adams and Hamilton and others of being monarchists, were accusing them of being despots, and saw the two as simply the same thing. I don't think it's entirely unfair to read Jefferson's writing that way even before the revolution, and his private letters that way. He was careful not to say so, and maybe he didn't think so. We should read him. We should take him seriously. We should take him at his word. But I don't think that Paine's reading of the question of the revolution is all that crazy. And so that idea is at least legitimately readable in some forms of the Declaration. Burke, I think for that reason, though I don't know why, never talks about the Declaration of Independence. We know that he knew about it. He was present physically in Parliament when it was read to the members. He heard it read. He never speaks about it in any of his speeches about America, which came after the Declaration. 2 of them did. He never writes about it even in his private letters. He writes an enormous amount about America and Americans. He knew a huge amount about what was going on here. The name of Thomas Jefferson never appears, even in his private letters, except in its being mentioned by Paine in letters to Burke. So he was very uncomfortable with that element of the American Revolution, even as he was essentially a supporter of the Americans in the debate about the American war in Britain. I think that was largely what he was uncomfortable with, the fear that this really was a radical revolution of the sort that he later saw embodied in France.
But isn't, if you apply Burke to Burke and you ask what is circumstantial about his own formulations, don't you have to raise the possibility that his own view of the British Constitution is in reaction to what he saw as the premier threats to the British Constitution, and his own gradualism is perhaps overstated precisely because of all the countries in Europe, certainly one of them to have the most political discord, the maximum number of kings hit with heads chopped off, and of revolutions and of churchly changes and so forth would be Great Britain. I mean, in many ways it was a basket case, crying out for someone to pour oil on those troubled waters, and in a way that's what Burke's formulations do.
Well, I think that's true, but does that argue for seeing him as responding to his circumstances, or does that argue for seeing him trying to apply principles that were not actually evident in his circumstances to the extent that he claims they were to the political life of Great Britain? Burke offers a history of Britain especially in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is preposterously wrong, and he certainly knows that. And he was criticized by some friends. There are some great letters about this where fans of the Reflections write to Burke saying, the British don't deserve your descriptions of them, that this isn't who we are. And Burke more or less says, well, it's who we ought to be. And the best way to persuade us to become that is to say that we already are that. I don't take that to be evidence of Burke's just responding to his circumstances. I think, on the contrary, it's evidence of his trying to apply a set of beliefs and principles that he thought would improve his own country to a country that he thought was in need of that kind of improvement.
But does it raise the possibility or the likelihood that if he had been in America, he would not be the Burke that we know?
Well, it's a possibility.
He would be a more American, he would sound more like an American figure.
Well, but I think there's no way that he wouldn't have been a conservative in the generation of the American founders. And there were conservatives in the generation of the American founders. So I don't think he would have sounded all that different. He would certainly have been responding to different circumstances and debates and problems. But the answer that he offered to those was an answer that was very much applicable in America, and in some respects was present in America. Burke very seriously considered moving to America as a young man. He was very interested in America.
As an Irishman, you mean?
As an Irishman, yes. A Protestant Irishman, so he would have been allowed to do it. He and a friend of his, Charles O'Hara, thought very seriously about it, made plans to do it. And then Burke got married, and his wife, as he puts it in a wonderful letter to O'Hara, just has no interest in being scalped by an Indian chief. And so they lived instead in London. They stayed in London. But he was fascinated by America, and especially by the spirit of liberty in America, which in the American speeches around the time of the Revolution, he's constantly drawn back to that and sees that as what is unique about the American character and what Parliament should recognize about the Americans, which is this constant, profound alertness to threats to their personal liberty. This is what made the Americans Americans. I think Burke was very drawn to that and shared in that to a great degree. But he was also a great believer in the importance of continuity and of stability. And that was his case for the American Revolution. And there was such a case for the American Revolution. I think it's an important part of what it is that conservatives are trying to conserve.